My name is Harish Khare and I am the current chair of Media Foundation of India. A very good evening to you all and welcome to this annual event of Media Foundation. This evening we shall be honoring the winner of this year's Chameli Devi Awards as well as have the privilege of listening to this year's George Verghese Memorial Lecture to be delivered by one of the most exciting, most knowledgeable media personality in the free world, Rusbridger. Before I talk about Alan, do permit me to say a few words about the Media Foundation. The Media Foundation was conceived and put together by P.G. Verghese and other high-minded editors and journalists in the mid-1970s. Verghese Saab and others were deeply moved and affected by the experience of internal democracy, which lasted from June 1975 to January 77. When the Indian media, like many other institutions, came under assault from a determined and vindictive government. Verghese Saab and others were deeply alarmed as to how easy it was for the government of the day to deny the media's autonomy, its robustness, and its professional space, just as they were disturbed about all too easy willingness of the media to fall in line. The idea was to reassert and restate some basic fundamental principles and values which characterize a free media. The Media Foundation brought together not just editors and journalists, but also professionals from different areas of artistic creativity, with the prime objective of defending and expanding freedom of speech and expression. Among its major activities, the Media Foundation takes pride in awarding every year a Chameli Devi Award to a woman journalist for outstanding performance. Since 1981, as many as 52 women professional journalists have been honored with this award. The Chameli Devi Award, it ought to be noted, has been instituted courtesy the generosity of the L.C. Jain family, which seeks through this gesture to remember L.C. Jain's mother, Chameli Devi, herself a pioneering activist. The Chameli Devi Award is decided upon by a selection committee of eminent professional journalists. This year, we were privileged to have Mr. Naresh Fernandez, editor Scroll.n, Ms. Vishaka Desarkar, an editor with the Hindu Business Line, and Nirmal Pathak, editor of PTI Bhasha, as the three members of the jury. On behalf of the Media Foundation, I wish to acknowledge our gratitude to Naresh and his colleagues on the jury. Besides the Chameli Devi Award, this evening we will also listen to the George Verghese Memorial Lecture. This lecture series has been made possible because of the generosity and support of the Verghese family. The Media Foundation remains grateful to the Verghese family for their continued involvement and encouragement. Now, to kick off this evening's proceedings, we shall have the jurors report for this year's Chameli Devi Awards.
Jurors report Chameli Devi Jain Award for an Outstanding Woman Journalist 2020. The past year presented unforeseen opportunities and unimaginable pressures for Indian journalists. 2020 started with protests across India against the government's citizenship initiatives and drew to a close with a massive agitation by farmers against new agricultural laws. In between, there was a pandemic that killed thousands and put the brakes on the economy, resulting in immense hardships for hundreds of millions of Indians. In February, Delhi was convulsed by the worst riots it had experienced in 3 decades. But even as so many momentous events occurred, each requiring in-depth reportage, so did the challenges. The economic health of the Indian media industry has really seemed more uncertain. With revenues falling, managements in newsrooms, large and small, effected significant layoffs. This left publications without adequate numbers of journalists to cover these events adequately and left experienced, enthusiastic journalists without forums or support to tell these critical stories. Alongside, the government moved under the cover of COVID to restrain journalists from telling inconvenient truths, jailing several, and filing criminal cases against others simply for doing their jobs. This was the context that made the task of the jurors of the Chameli Devi Jain Awards so difficult. 39 entries were received this year from 11 locations, not just from the metro cities, but also from Guwahati, Lucknow, Ranchi, and Patna. Though most of the entries were in English, 6 were in Hindi and 1 in Telugu. Reflecting the precariousness of the media sector, many of the women who sent in entries were independent journalists. Despite the constraints, the ambition and depth of the entries was stellar. Many of the entries involved an element of physical danger too, reporting from the midst of conflict and braving the risk of contracting the virus. Amidst a strong field of candidates, Neetu Singh's series on rape victims in Uttar Pradesh villages stood out for the manner in which it painstakingly tells the horrific human stories of sexual violence. The series highlights the trauma faced by the survivors, some as young as 12 or 13, and explains in detail problems they face on the socio-legal front. Well reported and narrated, these stories concern issues often raised by mainstream media, but not always followed up. In addition, these stories have taken stamina and have been reported in difficult terrain, working with an organization with limited means. Singh's stories are a source of inspiration for our peers. Vishakha Desarkar, Editor BA Link, Hindu Business Line, Nirmal Pathak, Editor Bhasha, PTI, Naresh Fernandez, Editor Scroll.in. Thank you.
The Chameli Devi Jain Award for an outstanding woman journalist is an annual recognition of those reporters who, through their work, courageously document stories, raise awareness on crucial issues, performing then a critical public service. This year, the award has been unanimously presented to Neetu Singh, a Lucknow-based senior reporter with Gaon Connections, India's largest bilingual rural media platform. In a 7-part series entitled Balatkar Ke Baad, she highlights the aftermath of those rape cases that have never made it to the headlines or become hashtags. Deeply reported, hugely impactful, Neetu interacts with 7 victims, most of them minors, and their families in an attempt to understand how a young girl's innocent world can suddenly turn upside down with one brutal act. These moving human stories are a powerful look at one of the country's most enduring problems. They also reveal the wide disconnect between high-profile rape cases and those that occur on a daily basis to hundreds of women living in small towns in India and in the rural hinterland. Neetu's innate talent for quality storytelling also appears in other series, such as Mothers of India, in which she profiles women suddenly left without support, yet through sheer grit and tenacity, still manage to make ends meet in professions that are conventionally thought of being out of bounds for women. She further insightfully chronicles the continuing existence of women manual scavengers who are compelled to gather human waste from homes in exchange for roti and pickles. For her deeply influential body of work, for reporting from the depths of Uttar Pradesh in the most challenging of circumstances, and for underlining the public and professional ideals of journalism. Neetu Singh is being presented with the 2020 Chameli Devi Jain Award for an outstanding woman journalist.
आप सभी को नमस्ते। आज इस विशेष मौके पर मैं अपने बारे में क्या क्या बताऊं, सोचने में काफी वक्त लग रहा है। क्या मैं आपको ये बताऊं कि मैं यूपी के कानपुर देहात जिले के डाढ़ापुर गांव की रहने वाली हूँ। एक ऐसे गांव की जहाँ पे आज भी आवागमन के 5 किलोमीटर तक संसाधन नहीं है, जहाँ पे शिक्षा के पर्याप्त संसाधन नहीं है, जहाँ पर बाजारें नहीं लगती हैं। एक हम कह सकते हैं मुश्किलों भरा जीवन है हमारे गांव के लोगों का, सरकारी योजनाएं नहीं पहुंच पाती हैं। ऐसे गांव में मेरा जन्म हुआ। हमारे गांव में आज भी लड़कियों की शादी 20 साल की उम्र में कर दी जाती है। करियर के इस सफर तक पहुंचने में मैंने अभी तक शादी नहीं की। मैं अपने गांव की इकलौती ऐसी लड़की हूँ जिसने इस उम्र तक अभी तक शादी नहीं की। क्या मैं आपको ये बताऊं कि मेरे परिवार में कौन कौन है? हम 3 बहनें हैं, मैं सबसे बड़ी हूँ। मेरी 2 छोटी बहनों की शादी हो गई है। जब मैंने हाई स्कूल की पढ़ाई की थी तब मेरी माँ का देहांत हो गया, तो मैं पढ़ाई कर रही थी। मेरी माँ का सपना था कि मैं बहुत ज़्यादा पढ़ूँ, मैं बहुत आगे तक जाऊँ। मेरी माँ ज़्यादा पढ़ी लिखी नहीं थी, पर मेरी माँ ये ज़रूर चाहती थी कि मैं कम से कम ज़्यादा ना पढ़ूँ, 10वीं पढ़ लूँ। मैं अपने गाँव की इकलौती ऐसी लड़की हूँ जिसने मास्टर डिग्री कंप्लीट की है। मैं अपने गांव की इकलौती ऐसी लड़की हूँ जिसने जर्नलिज्म में अपना करियर बनाया है। मैं ये भी कह सकती हूँ कि मैं अपने क्षेत्र की ऐसी पहली लड़की हूँ जिसने जर्नलिज्म को अपना करियर चुना। मेरी माँ के देहांत के बाद मेरी दादी ने मेरी परवरिश की। आज इस विशेष मौके पर मैं खुले मन से ये स्वीकार करती हूँ कि मुझे इस मुकाम तक पहुँचाने में मेरे परिजनों का, मेरे रिश्तेदारों का, मेरे दोस्तों का, मेरे सहकर्मियों का, मेरे संस्थान का बहुत योगदान रहा है। मैं ये चमेली देवी जैन प्रतिष्ठित अवार्ड अपनी दादी को समर्पित करती हूँ, क्योंकि मेरी दादी ने मेरी इस पढ़ाई के लिए, मैं एक साधारण परिवार की जन्मी लड़की हूँ और हमारे पास इतना पैसा नहीं था कि हम जर्नलिज्म जैसी पढ़ाई में अपना दाखिला करा पाते। तो हमारे दादी ने अपने वो गहने गिरवी रख के मेरी पढ़ाई के लिए फीस दी थी जो उन्होंने अपने बुढ़ापे के लिए रखे थे। मैं ये अवार्ड उन्हें समर्पित करती हूँ और मैं गर्व महसूस करती हूँ कि उनकी मेहनत, जो मेरी माँ ने सपना देखा था, जो मेरे बाबा चाहते थे, जो मेरे पापा चाहते थे, शायद मैं आज सफल कर पा रही हूँ। क्या मैं आपको ये बताऊं कि कानपुर देहात एक छोटे से गांव की जन्मी लड़की इस जगह तक कैसे पहुंची? मैंने 2011 में मई 2011 में अपने करियर की शुरुआत कम्युनिटी रेडियो से की, जो कानपुर देहात का एक रेडियो स्टेशन है जिसका नाम वक्त की आवाज़ है। मुझे ठीक से नहीं याद है कि मेरी पहली तनख्वाह कितनी थी, पर मुझे इतना ज़रूर याद है कि लगभग 2000 रुपये से मैंने अपने करियर की शुरुआत की। मैं अपने घर से 100 किलोमीटर दूर किराए के एक घर में रहती थी, जहाँ से मैंने अपने करियर का पहला सफ़र चुना। मुझे अपने काम से हमेशा से प्यार रहा, क्योंकि मैंने एक ऐसे सब्जेक्ट को अपने करियर के तौर पे चुना था जिसमें हमारे दूर दूर तक किसी का कोई नाता नहीं था। मुझे खुद को प्रूव करना था अपने इस करियर में। मुझे खुद को बताना था कि जर्नलिज्म, क्योंकि मुझे हमेशा से यही बताया गया है कि जर्नलिज्म में वही सक्सेस हो सकता है जो जिसके पास बहुत पैसा हो, जिसकी बहुत पहचान हो, जिसने उच्च जाति में जन्म लिया हो। कई तरह की मेरी धारणाएं थी और यहाँ तक आज पहुँचने में शायद ये सारी धारणाएं टूट गई हैं। मैं हर एक लड़की से ये कहना चाहूंगी कि कभी भी किसी भी चीज को बाधा ना बनने दें। बस अगर आप मन से काम करेंगे तो आपको एक दिन सफलता जरूर मिलेगी। कम्युनिटी रेडियो में जब मैंने काम करने की शुरुआत की, वो शुरुआती दौर था जब वहाँ पे लाइसेंस की प्रक्रिया चल रही थी। रेडियो स्टेशन को भी लाइसेंस नहीं मिला था, बिल्डिंग नहीं मिली थी। 6 साल तक मैंने वहाँ के 300 गाँव में काम किया। 3 लाख लोग मुझे सुनते थे। नीतू के नाम की पहचान वहीं से हुई थी। 3 लाख लोग नीतू सिंह को जानते थे। तब मुझे खुद पे मेरा जो भरोसा था वो बढ़ता गया कि शायद मैं और आगे बढ़ूंगी और भी बेहतर कर पाऊंगी। मैं गांव में जाके काम करती थी। मैंने हर एक मुद्दे पे काम किया, चाहे वो पंचायती राज हो, चाहे वो सैनिटेशन हो, चाहे वो मेंस्ट्रुअल हाइजीन हो, चाहे वो दूसरे मुद्दे हों। मैंने कई मुद्दों पे काम किया। हमारा काम रहता था गांव में जाना, लोगों से बात करना, उनके मुद्दों को समझना, उस पर स्क्रिप्ट लिखना, उसकी रिकॉर्डिंग करना, एडिटिंग करना, ब्रॉडकास्ट करना, बतौर एंकर उसका प्रेजेंटेशन करना। 6 साल का कैरियर रहा। 6 साल बाद मैंने वक्त गाँव कनेक्शन को चुना। मई 2016 में गाँव कनेक्शन में मैं आई और अभी मुझे लगभग 5 साल पूरे होने को हैं इस सफर में। एक बहुत कठिन मुद्दा था, एक मुश्किल समय था जब मैं वक्त की आवाज़ में जब मैं काम कर रही थी। वो एक अलग तरह का काम था। गाँव कनेक्शन में एक दूसरे तरह का काम था, यानी एक इलेक्ट्रॉनिक मीडिया का, एक प्रिंट मीडिया का। तो जब मैं गाँव कनेक्शन में आई, गाँव कनेक्शन में मैंने उन हर तरह के काम को किया जो मैं करना चाहती थी। मुझे एक बड़ा आयाम मिला। गाँव वक्त की आवाज एक छोटे शहर, एक जिले का कार्यक्रम था। गाँव कनेक्शन एक बृहद पैमाने का कार्यक्रम था। बृहद पैमाने की सोच थी। एक ऐसी जर्नलिज्म थी जिसको मैं देखती थी, अक्सर पढ़ती थी अखबारों में। मैं वही करना चाहती थी। मैं दिल से शुक्रिया कहना चाहूंगी गाँव कनेक्शन के फाउंडर नीलेश सर का, जिन्होंने मुझे इतना ज़्यादा संवेदनशील बनाया, इतनी ज़्यादा मेंटरशिप दी, इतने बेहतर तरीके से दिशा निर्देशन दिया कि मैं महिला मुद्दे को और करीबी से समझ पाई। मुझे आज भी याद है कि हम एक बार सर के साथ साझा कर रहे थे कि सीतापुर में एक बच्ची के साथ रेप हुआ है, दलित परिवार की है। सर अगले दिन हमारे साथ गाड़ी को उस रिपोर्टिंग को करने के लिए, स्टोरी को करने पहुँच गए थे। जब भी मैं इस तरह की स्टोरी उनके साथ साझा करती थी तो उनके आंखों में मैंने आंसू देखे हैं, तकलीफ देखी है। मुद्दों की गंभीरता मेरे दिमाग में यहीं से उठी। मैं बहुत खुद किस्मत मानती हूँ अपने आप को कि गाँव कनेक्शन मुझे एक ऐसा प्लेटफॉर्म मिला जहाँ पर मैं वो काम कर पाई जो मेरे मन का काम था। मुझे अपने काम को करने की पूरी आज़ादी मिली। मैंने झारखंड, मध्य प्रदेश, उत्तराखंड, यूपी के सैकड़ों गाँव के उस तबके की आवाज़ को इसकी स्टोरी कवर की जिन तक अक्सर मेरी मीडिया या तो पहुँचता नहीं है या तो उन खबरों को कवर नहीं करता है। मेरी जो साल 2020 की स्टोरी के लिए मुझे चमेली देवी जैन अवार्ड के लिए चयनित किया गया है, उसमें मैंने जो मैंने स्टोरी भेजी थी वो मैंने भेजी थी आफ्टर द रेप, यानी बलात्कार के बाद। 7 पार्ट की सीरीज थी। इस सीरीज में उन लड़कियों की कहानी थी जिनके साथ रेप हुए 2-3 साल हो चुके थे। अभी उनकी जिंदगी कैसी है, उनके केस में अभी तक क्या चल रहा है, किस तरह की सामाजिक पीड़ाओं से होकर वो गुजर रही है। हमने इसमें एक सीरीज की थी जब हाथरस और बलरामपुर, बदायूं या बाराबंकी जैसे केस चल रहे थे। उस समय रेप के बाद से लड़कियों की शिक्षा पे क्या असर पड़ता है, दलित समुदाय के लिए रेप की घटनाओं के बाद कितनी चुनौतियों का सामना करना पड़ता है, महिला किसान और खेती मजदूरों के लिए कितनी मुश्किलें आती हैं, वो अपने आप को कितना असुरक्षित महसूस करती है। हमने एक मदर्स ऑफ इंडिया सीरीज की थी जिससे हमने ऐसी महिलाओं की कहानियों को चुना था जो लगातार सकारात्मक खबरें कर रही थी, जो लगातार जिन्होंने ऐसे काम को चुना जो हमेशा से पुरुषों के काम को माना जाता था। ऐसी मैंने 10 कहानियों को भेजा था। मैं बहुत शुक्रिया कहना चाहूँगी चमेली देवी अवार्ड जिन्होंने मुझे चयनित किया, मीडिया फाउंडेशन को, उस दूरी को थैंक यू कहना चाहूँगी कि आपने गाँव से निकली एक साधारण लड़की की प्रतिभा को पहचाना, उसकी मेहनत को समझा और आपने मुझे इस अवार्ड के लिए चयनित किया। मैं शुक्रिया कहना चाहूँगी अपने सहकर्मियों का, अपने सभी मित्रों का, अपने संस्थान का, एक ऐसे संस्थान का जहाँ पर मुझे वो सब काम करने की आज़ादी मिली जो मैं करना चाहती थी। मैं भविष्य में क्या करना चाहूँगी मैं ज़रूर आप सबके साथ साझा करना चाहूँगी। मेरी एक ही ख्वाहिश है, मैं सिर्फ यूपी नहीं, मैं देश के अलग अलग राज्यों में जाना चाहती हूँ। मैं वंचित तबके की उन कहानियों को कवर करना चाहती हूँ जहाँ अक्सर लोग पहुँच नहीं पाते हैं। मैं घूम घूम कर पत्रकारिता करना चाहती हूँ। मैं फ्री होकर पत्रकारिता करना चाहती हूँ। मैं उस समुदाय की आवाज़ बनना चाहती हूँ, खासकर ग्रामीण क्षेत्रों के उस तबके की कहानियों को लाना चाहती हूँ जो कहानियाँ अक्सर दर्शाती हैं। तो इस मौके पर आप सभी को पुनः बहुत शुक्रिया। और ये अवार्ड महज एक अवार्ड नहीं है मेरे लिए, ये उत्साह और ऊर्जा है जिसने मुझे ये हौसला दिया है कि गांव देहात से निकली लड़की अगर आज इस मुकाम तक पहुंच सकती है तो किसी भी लड़की के लिए ये अवार्ड पाना असंभव नहीं है, हर कोई अवार्ड पा सकता है। आप सभी का पुनः बहुत शुक्रिया।
Now, a word about Ellen Rusbridger, our speaker this evening. Ellen Rusbridger can only be described as the authentic and authoritative custodian of journalistic values and good practices. To most senior journalists in India, he needs no introduction. But nonetheless, let me say a few words about him. Ellen is at present the principal of Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, as well as member of the Facebook Oversight Board, and he is also the chair of the Reuters Institute for Study of Journalism. And his most distinguished stint as a professional journalist has been as the editor-in-chief of the Guardian News and Media from 1995 to 2015. During that time, the Guardian became known as one of the most liberal, fair-minded and authoritative source of news and views in the world. No wonder the newspaper was nominated Newspaper of the Year 5 times between 1996 and 2040. He himself was named editor thrice, and meanwhile he had also collected a number of awards and distinctions, including Liberty Human Rights Award, European Press Prize, and many others. He has been honored by many universities. But not just being a good editor, he is also a man with different tastes. He plays piano, plays clarinet, and an avid photographer. He has also written 3 books for children as well as for adult journalists. His most recent books include Breaking News, Remaking of Journalism and Why It Matters Now, and News and How to Use It. The topic he has chosen for his talk this evening is what journalists can and should learn from social media. Social media, as we know, in its various manifestations, has come to redefine the practices and protocol of journalism. Governments, large corporations, NGOs operating in civil society, all have learned to come to grip with this new mode of distribution and delivery of information, facts, news, views, photographs. And because of social media, the once familiar world of newspaper and journalists is challenged and jolted. It is therefore entirely appropriate that we should want to learn a few things from the most authentic Guru, perhaps the Vishnu Guru, Ellen Rusbridger. Over to you, Ellen.
Thank you for asking me to give this lecture today. I've called it What Journalists Can and Should Learn from Social Media. And I want to apologise for 2 things in advance. One is for my hair, which hasn't seen a barber in a long time. And the other is I'm going to talk quite a lot about British journalism and to some extent American journalism. I think the things I'm going to talk about are fairly universally applicable. But I have to warn you that there is that context in advance. So, next slide. We know we're living in a world of information chaos. What is real? What is fake? Increasingly, in a lot of countries, people find this a very troubling question. They don't know what the answer is. The next slide shows that half the people in many countries where they're polled say they don't know, they're disengaging with news. 2/3 say they can't now tell the difference between good journalism and rumour and falsehood. And that's really scary. It's really scary to live in a country where you know now no longer who to believe. It's going to be, in the next slide, a particular problem with younger people, because we know they're more likely to turn to social media. And the next slide shows how in many countries trust is a real problem. Trust is the media are the least trusted institution. That's the UK, quite low in trust. India doing better. In this survey, in a little while into the COVID virus, newspapers the bottom, NHS the top. Well, you would expect the NHS to be scoring well, but it is sobering to think that newspapers absolutely bottom of the pile in terms of trust. And there's some sense that India has not got a lot to be complacent about, particularly as we know that it is the habit of younger readers who are getting most of their news now from screens, a lot of it from social media. And so that's our starting point, that trust and information chaos is all around. My last book was, on the news slide, was called Breaking News. And that was the story of my 20 years at The Guardian editing and how we were on this journey from a printed newspaper to a digital product. I remember lots of trips to India during that period when I was told by a lot of Indian journalists that this was not going to affect them so much, but I think maybe that story has now changed. And I've now written this new book, with a new slide, News and How to Use It, and I've written it in alphabetical form, and it's a book that faces two ways. It's facing at readers, trying to help them understand the complexity of why they should trust news and maybe how to trust news. But I also hope it's read by journalists and makes journalists reflect on what they're doing and how much we demand of our readers in expecting them to completely understand our business. I think sometimes we don't understand our own business. And of course, the starting point for this talk is that we could just all agree that social media is rubbish and it's awful and the big tech companies are awful and we have nothing to learn from them. But I think that's a very short-sighted view. I think whatever else they are, they're tremendously popular. We know that those companies make enormous sums of money. They're very commercially successful. But also I'm very interested in how the best of them are negotiating these questions of trust in a different kind of way from how journalism has thought of itself in the past. So let's plunge in. I'm going to skip the A's. One of the A's is accuracy, which is a more complicated question than maybe some people think. And here we are on B. And I chose Brexit because there you are going to the people and saying essentially you choose the future of Britain. And if you're going to ask citizens to do that, I think you have to inform them. You have to say, here, I'm going to arm you with the arguments on both sides. I might also tell you what we think, but that's not as important as ensuring that you have got the information on which to base a decision. And that's almost the opposite of what a lot of British newspapers did, as you can see from those front pages. And it sort of got uglier as time went on. With these kind of front pages, that terrible front page, enemies of the people, accusing judges of being enemies and singling out people who dared defy the will of the newspapers in really, I thought, quite a dangerous way. And it was not how I think of journalism. I think of journalism, as I say, of informing people so that you can have a more informed electorate. That's the classic defence of journalism. And yet a lot of newspapers have moved quite a long way from that position. Moving on to C's. Next slide. Chaff. You know the well-known phrase that an editor is someone who selects the wheat from the chaff and then prints the chaff. And I just chose some examples there of exactly what I'm talking about. Ed Miliband, you may have seen that photograph of him eating a bacon sandwich, not very elegantly. It was used thousands of times in the coverage of the last but one election. And the point is that it's an embarrassing picture, but nobody appoints a prime minister on their ability to eat a bacon sandwich. That's almost the least important thing about him, just like the way his brother held a banana, or Michael Foot's wore the wrong jacket, or Neil Kinnock fell into the sea, or are British passports going to be blue or red, or has Theresa May got great legs, or did Barack Obama commit a terrible social gaffe by wearing the wrong colour suit, or Hillary Clinton's emails. A huge number of stories about that. Arguably, does anybody think that was the most important thing about that election in 2016? Chinese walls I chose, and I know this is a hot subject sometimes in India, but the Chinese walls, the story we tell ourselves, the story we tell our readers, is that we have commercial departments, we have editorial departments, but the two of them never meet. Because readers have to believe that when we tell them things, it's not because people are giving us money, it's because we sincerely believe these things to be true. The moment people stop believing that, then you're in trouble. And yet we know there are newspapers around the world where those walls have come down, and yet we still want to try and persuade the readers that we have these Chinese walls. The next slide shows that this thing called native advertising, which is so popular nowadays, really important, is really almost a deliberate attempt to pull down those Chinese walls. It's almost a deliberate attempt to say, we want to give you advertising that looks like editorial because people might trust that more, which is only a stone throw away from what happens on the internet with so-called influencers, where people who look like normal people are not always completely open and frank about who's paying them to endorse a product. So this question, it's a sort of touching point of the commercial world and the editorial world, but again, it's the story we tell. Moving on through the C's, journalism. It was a word coined by my colleague Nick Davis in the book that he wrote in 2008, Flat Earth News. And it described what Nick did was to look at the number of stories a journalist had to write during one shift. A shift might be 8 hours. They might have to write 8 stories, 10 stories. And so he just did the maths. It takes 20 minutes to write a story. It takes 15 minutes to read the press release. And that gave almost no time in which to interrogate the story or make the phone calls or add what journalism should add. So if you're just taking it and processing it and not making any queries, then you're really pulling a fraud on the public, because the public think you're doing something more than that. And yet, for all kinds of reasons, that's happening in a lot of newsrooms. We understand that the economics of that, but it's one of the things that doesn't help trust in journalism. I move on to C for climate change, and you might think that this was the biggest test of journalism, that this is the most important story of our lives. If we get this one wrong, we're in real trouble as a species, and that journalism, A, should be giving this the weight that it deserves, B, should be really rigorous in telling you the truth about climate change, and therefore earn a path to trust. But that's not what's happening in a lot of newsrooms. A lot of newsrooms either don't believe. I'm afraid for a lot of titles they were run by people who didn't really believe in climate change, or thought it was a bit of a turn off for the readers, and they didn't want to write about it much because readers didn't like reading about it. I've chosen two really quite prominent commentators in the UK on the left. A man called James Delingpole, who's an English graduate, not a scientist. On the right, a historian called Christopher Booker. And for both of them, appeared repeatedly in Christopher Booker's case for 30 or 40 years, writing about something they didn't believe existed. James Delingpole was the climate change correspondent of the website Breitbart, just doesn't believe in climate change. And yet he was used by a lot of the British press as their go-to person for climate change because he writes amusingly and controversially. And Christopher Booker, when he died, his own obituary in his own paper admitted that quite often his columns were just completely inaccurate, but readers kind of loved them anyway. That's fine, but if we're trying to tell one story about what we do, the craft of journalism, because remember, we're better than the rest, that's the chaos, we're the people you should be turning to. If you don't take a story like climate change seriously, and if you don't tell the truth about it, then why should people come to newspapers? And I can promise you, young people, when they read stuff like that, they think, why, how could I trust newspapers to tell me about this thing that I consider the most important thing in my life? And so they go elsewhere, and that's really bad commercially. Echo, E for echo chambers, I put that in because it's one of those things that we hear a lot about social media. It's just people listening to people they agree with. Well, first of all, we don't know that that's actually true. It's one of the many things we don't know about social media, whether that is just people in little bubbles. A lot of research out of Oxford, the Oxford Internet Institute and the Reuters Institute, seem to suggest that actually more people are exposed to more sources nowadays than ever before. And also it makes me think, how free are we from that? I know when I grew up as a kid, in my parents' home, we took the Daily Telegraph and we listened to the BBC. That was a media bubble. That was an echo chamber, if you like. Very restricted number of media sources. And I think sometimes in some cultures, we want people to live in our media bubble and with our views which suit their views. And so we need to be a bit careful about this word, echo chambers. Next slide, E for editors. That's what editors used to look like, often with beards. And they were men of great wisdom and dynamism. And we come on to it later with gatekeepers and proprietors, but I think younger people are now saying, and they're asking questions, well, who are these people and who are they to tell me what to think, or who are they to make the selection about what I know? Maybe I prefer to live in a world, see climate change. If they're the guys who are telling me that climate change isn't happening, why would I trust them? And I wrote a bit about Piers Morgan, who's been in the news recently, who is in some ways a very talented journalist, was made editor of the News of the World, Britain's biggest paper, when he was in his mid to late 20s. And he suddenly had the power to make or break people, to be enormously political influential. He went on to edit the Daily Mirror. And I think people say, well, there's no one else really in society who has that degree of power, unaccountable power. And so we need to know a bit more about who these people are. Next slide is F for fairness. Fox News calls itself fair. I can never work out if it's a joke or whether it really wants you to believe it. But it's one of those words, fairness, impartiality, balance, that we throw around without really interrogating. And it's true that some readers don't want fairness. If you want Fox News, you're probably not going to Fox News because it's going to be fair. It's because you live in an echo chamber. But a lot of people get very turned off by that. And if we're going to understand our readers, we should understand whether fairness is what they want, and also whether fairness is actually just a good thing in journalism. Giving both sides, being fair to both sides, is just what journalists should do. I moved on to the next slide with fake news because it's one of those words that is thrown around so carelessly without really interrogating what it means. And that's how Donald Trump has used it repeatedly during his time in office. And it shows you the dangers of this word. That he would repeatedly call, the New York Times, which is one of the best newspapers in the world, fake news. And then he just brandished this word about anybody who disagreed with him. And that's why we should be very wary of this word, fake news, because really it was, we can see what Trump was trying to do. He was trying to say, look, if I can persuade you that the best newspapers are not to be trusted, then maybe you can believe me in anything I say. Next slide. F for Robert Fisk. I decided to do some entries for individual journalists because I thought, well, you've got readers who don't know about particular brands or they don't know about proprietors, all the questions that we've been talking about so far. And they may say, well, I trust this particular journalist. And there's no question a lot of readers of The Independent trusted Robert Fisk. He was a very notable correspondent in the Middle East for a long time. There he is, he can charge, or could charge, he died at the end of last year, £25,000 for a speech. There's no question he had many great qualities as a reporter. But I know from speaking to many people who worked with him in the Middle East that he was considered less reliable by a lot of his colleagues, some of whom said actually quite blunt things about him, especially once he had died, to the extent of questioning his veracity. And so if you've got somebody who is simultaneously revered by readers but not so much by the people he worked with, how do you deal that? And I spent about a week looking at some of his stories, especially on Syria, to try and work out how a reader would be able to work out the difference between truth and not truth. And it's difficult. I found that at the end of a week I just didn't know. And I thought, well, here I am. I've edited a newspaper for 40 years, for 20 years, journalist for 40 years. I've spent a week, which very few readers are going to have at that time. They won't have a day. They may not even have an hour in which to make those kind of judgments. So it was a way of saying, it's another way of looking at this problem that we set readers and the lens through which they decide how to trust people. And I guess there's also a question for some of Robert Fisk's editors, what did they know and when did they know it? Freddie Starr at My Hamster, another F page. That was not true. Freddie Starr, who was a rather, in my view, unfunny comic, that story was sold to The Sun by Max Clifford, a rather evil man who had died in prison where he was convicted for paedophile offences. And it was one of those stories that I think was probably not expected to be taken terribly seriously, but The Sun had something like 4 million readers. It was the most, some said the most influential paper in Britain at the time. And it was a sort of, journalism is a bit of a joke. Don't take us too seriously. Tomorrow we will use that same space to tell you something important and we will want you to believe it. It comes back to what we expect our readers. We expect them a lot if we think we can tell them jokes one day and then use the same front page for news that we want to believe. Next slide, G for gatekeepers. We need to remind ourselves, it's a bit like with editors. Until 20 years ago, if you owned the printing press or you owned the broadcasting studio, normally it was just rich billionaire men who did that, then you had a monopoly on news. People had very few other sources that they could go to. That was a world which has changed immensely in the last 20 years, that now There are 4 billion people who can effectively publish. We're listening to our peers much more sometimes than looking up to people who are the gatekeepers. And we're also questioning. We're saying, well, who are they to be the gatekeepers? Who appointed them to choose what we read or what views we should have? It's part of a new questioning in the 21st century. Next slide, G for Grenfell, the terrible disaster that hit that tower block in London. And what happened the next morning was lots of reporters went down there, and 2 things happened. One is that they got shouted at by the residents who said, well, look, you never came here. This has been an open secret. You only come down here where people die, because that's your concept of views. You don't care with people of our class. Poor people live in a very unsafe building. And of course, the other thing that was very noticeable was that lots of the reporters were, comfortably off white, middle-class people, and that was not true of the people that was there. And that's a big problem, I think, in journalism in lots of parts of the world, where there's a gulf between the people who are writing the news or broadcasting the news and the people who are being written about, and it speaks to the need for diversity. Here's another individual journalist, great journalist, Seymour Hersh, responsible for some of the most amazing stories from Vietnam. And on the right of that picture, there is a man called Elliot Higgins, internet geek, nerd, one of these guys who sits in a bedroom blogging. And we know who we prefer, don't we? We prefer Seymour Hersh because he's got the great reputation. He's the kind of reporter we want to be. And the point of juxtaposing those two is that there came a point 2 or 3 years ago when Elliot Higgins, who just made himself very knowledgeable about one thing, which was basically weaponry, really embarrassed Seymour Hersh over a story that he'd written just by using modern techniques of investigation. So Seymour Hersh's generation, true of a lot of reporters today, you're working on a story, you don't tell people what you're working on because it's your story and you want to go ta-da at the end. Elliot Higgins, now known as Bellingcat, his website, does the opposite. He says, look, hey guys, I'm working on this story, shall we all work on it together? And he then crowdsources stories and uses the incredible ability of the internet to bring people together and investigate stories in that you just wouldn't have thought possible. The most famous one recently was working out who the 2 Russians were who'd visited Salisbury to try and bump off a Russian dissident. He's just written a book about Bellingcat, and he's just one of these figures the internet has thrown up who are just extraordinary. Impartiality. It's another one of these words that we throw out a bit and expect people to understand, but it's a very difficult word. The BBC is supposed to be impartial. I've used a little picture of Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's, until recently, his sort of advisor, who really didn't like the BBC and wanted to replace it with F for Fairness and Fox News. But if we're going to have a concept like impartiality, we better understand what it means and who's going to police it and whose idea of impartiality it is. If you live in a country with a lot of right-wing newspapers, they will try and persuade you that impartiality is over here and not over there. And it's one of those words we need to interrogate as journalists. Next slide, invisible mending. So this comes back to the craft of journalism and whether we think we've got an agreed craft. There are some news organizations that they realize they've made a mistake and they try and correct it invisibly. So, our readers don't want to know what the mistake was, but we'll rewrite it now so that it's right. That's invisible mending. Visible mending is where you say, as a paper like the New York Times does, at the bottom or at the top, you say, the original version of this story said X, we realize that was wrong, and this is how we've corrected it. So people can see the sort of audit trail of news. And there are 2 very different approaches to how to think of news and how it should work. And I personally think invisible mending is not the way to go. Next slide, J for journalists. This is, in a way, the most basic question of all. Who gets to be a journalist? Who calls themselves a journalist in this world in which people round the clock are broadcasting the most amazing pictures and opinions and news and photographs and videos, a lot of which feels journalistic, and a lot of which journalists take and use because you've got millions of people behaving like journalists. But it becomes a really interesting question with the next slide with these kind of characters. There's Julian Assange, calls himself a journalist. In some ways is, in some ways isn't. Steve Bannon. There's Elliot Higgins again. I'm not sure if he does call himself a journalist. I think he calls himself an investigator. But nevertheless, it's going to become a more important question as time goes on, not least because of the legal protections that journalists want. The only real journalist, in inverted commas, in that slide is Judy Miller on the bottom right, the New York Times correspondent who the New York Times effectively later disowned. She did go to prison for failing to reveal her sources, but some people felt she was guilty of helping to lead America into a war on the basis of weapons of mass destruction, which she said existed and then people later thought didn't. Next slide, I've chosen M for metrics. And any journalist over a certain age will remember living in a world in which you couldn't really tell, particularly in newspapers, who was reading what. I remember inviting readers in, and you would give them a felt tip pen, and they would sit there and mark newspapers up. Well, of course, now you've got a very precise knowledge of who's read what for how long, when they stopped reading, what they did after they were reading. And that becomes really important because you can set your metrics to incentivize reporters and editors to make money, to get eyeballs, to give readers more of what they want on stories because they might take subscriptions out, or the kind of stories that advertisers like. So how you set your metrics affects your newsroom. And what happens if we discover that readers are a bit scared of climate change stories? They don't want to read them. Does that mean that we're going to give readers fewer stories about climate change? You can't talk, next slide, about the media without dealing with Rupert Murdoch. That's a very unkind picture of him. I chose it for two reasons. One is because he's printed lots of unkind pictures of other people in his long time at the top. But also because it's got a kind of sort of Wizard of Oz moment. Here he is, he's 90 now. He's surely can't last much longer in charge of a gigantic corporation. And we thought of him as this immensely powerful man who really ran everything. That's, I'm sure, how he would be preferred to be thought of in his younger days. The next slide. And it fits into a picture of proprietors, nearly all of them men, nearly all of them rich men, powerful men. And I think, again, people are saying, well, who are they and why do they own a newspaper? There are easier ways of making money nowadays. So are they doing it for power, for political power, for commercial power? Are they doing it to try and help their businesses, to be socially influential, to get a seat in the House of Lords? So again, in trying to work out, if you place yourself in the shoes of the readers, does Rupert Murdoch determine what goes in the Sun? Is it the same for the Wall Street Journal or the Times? The Barclay brothers, I would guess, did have quite a big influence on the Telegraph editorial line. Richard Desmond certainly told the Daily Express what to write on things like Brexit. But with the Daily Mail, I think it's different. It was the editor there, Paul Dacre, who ruled the roost, and Lord Rothermere not so much. But these, again, are subtle things that we expect readers to understand, but maybe that's asking a lot. The next slide shows press barons. We still have press barons of people who literally get a seat in the House of Lords and the power of really ruling over us, making laws for the rest of their lives. The figure on the right there is Yevgeny Lebedev, a nice man who bought the Evening Standard. He's the son of a KGB agent. And suddenly he's in the House of Lords making laws. Is that why he owns these papers? And can you have it both ways? The press, we tell the story that the press is independent of power. But if you say, I want to be independent of power, but I also want to be power, is that not a complicated story? S, I chose slow, the word slow. So much of journalism today is so fast, especially on these devices. We're constantly updating them to have the latest there. You want the latest scores, the latest breaking news, the latest pictures. And we get used as journalists to working faster and faster and faster. And there's this website, Tortoise, edited by the former editor of The Times, James Harding, who said, well, look, he had the motto, slow down, wise up. Because some things can't be understood at pace. And sometimes you do need to read books or talk to people or go out and spend time slogging around in order to get to the truth of something. And so slow is a good word for journalism. Sources. This is S for sources. Next slide. Again, this is one of those words where we expect journalists our readers to be able to understand what we mean by sources, how we use them. And it's a complicated story, sources, because I think as journalists, we'll understand that that we need people who are not named. We need anonymous sources in order sometimes to be able to tell the truth about stories. But the danger is you then tip too far the other way and you become reliant on anonymous sources. And that is then requiring a lot of trust from the readers. You're saying, look, I've spoken to this person. I can't tell you who they are, but you better believe me that they told me what I'm telling you, and that they are who I'm saying they are. And that's a big leap of trust. And the rules with the next slide about how many sources you need to be sure that something is true, and how open you are about sources, how you protect sources, all these are very vital questions for journalists today. So I'm reaching the end now, and I've just chosen T for trust, and I'm going to talk through some of the techniques that I think we've been touching on so far in this talk. And some of them, I suppose the point is to say that we need to rethink about how trust is earned in the 21st century. So here are 10 things. The first is, don't expect or demand trust. So you can't, I think a lot of people maybe came from a generation where they said, I work for this paper or that paper. I work for the BBC or the Financial Times. That's not how people behave on the internet. They say, I'm not asking you to trust me because of who I am. I'm going to ask you to trust me because of how I tell you something, which leads to the second point, the link. If you're not saying, look, I've read this document, I'm not going to show it to you or tell you where you can read it for yourselves, just take my word for it. That's very different from, again, how a lot of people on the internet behave, where they say, look, don't take my word for it. I've read this, but here it is. Here's the screenshot. Here's the picture. Here's the evidence. Here's the summary. Go and find out for yourself so that you can make a judgment on whether I can be trusted or not. Transparency, number 3. I think we assume that readers understand all these things about how we work, and I'm not sure they do. So let's be a bit more emphatic in saying, look, this is what news is, this is what comment is, this is how advertising works. Let's tell you more about how news is gathered. The next one, point 4, engagement. Again, on the internet, people don't behave like they did in the days when they had the printing press or the broadcasting studios. They don't just say, look, here it is, take it or leave it. They tend to engage. They say, look, I'd be interested in what you think about this, and if you don't agree, let's have a discussion. It's two-way. It's multiple ways. That's what media is today, rather than just throwing the newspaper over a wall and saying, there it is. Again, I think people are more likely to trust people if they feel they're there and are prepared to speak to them. That leads on to point 5 about clarifying and correcting. I think a lot of journalists used to think, well, it's painful to have to correct, admit you were wrong. But also I think some journalists actually seriously believed, well, if we're always correcting things, that will undermine trust because people won't know that they can trust us. Whereas I think the opposite is true. If people can see, they'll be forgiving if they can see that you are willing to correct. Point 6 is really the Grenfell point, that that you have to show that you understand your readers, that you can reflect their lives in your coverage, and that you're not a sort of class apart from the community that you're reporting on. And I think that's good for business, and it's good for editorial trust. Point 7 is about authenticity. Sometimes you have to, the claims that we make for journalism, we tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Well, let's use the word evidence or facts. The truth is a very difficult thing to get at. Maybe we should more often admit what we don't know as much as what we do know, and sometimes use a slightly more human tone of voice rather than the tone of voice we used to use when we were, as it were, a bit on a platform or in the pulpit. Number 8 comes back to the point about anonymous sources. And of course, as journalists, we all understand that sometimes we have to rely on anonymous sources. But if you put yourselves in the shoes of readers, and sometimes I read stories now, I see 20 anonymous sources in a story, and I think, okay, I suppose I trust that all these people exist and that they said what they said and they are who this person tells me that they are. So we just need to be careful about sources and place ourselves in the shoes of readers. Point 9 is about negativity. There's a big movement in Scandinavia now about constructive journalism. It's not just looking for things that are wrong, but looking for things that are right and how we can make things better. And of course, we understand that news, to be interesting, has to be a little bit extraordinary. So if a dog bites a man, that's not really interesting. It happens so often. So we write stories about men that bite dogs. But by doing that, we're distorting the reality, because generally men don't go around biting dogs. So if we're always writing about things that are catastrophic and awful and dangerous and disasters, we are creating a version of the world that is not actually normal, and we have to be aware of that. It may be interesting, but sometimes our service to truth ought to be greater. And finally, this most obvious basic point about separating fact from opinion, and assuming that readers know the difference. Again, we come back to sometimes a simple thing like the size of a screen, and we may think that we label things and say, look, this is fact and this is opinion, but that may not be obvious on a screen. And increasingly, I think readers think, look, I like both facts and opinion, but I do like to know what it is that I'm being given. And the Reuters survey I quote there, it's widely disliked when comment is dressed up as a news article or spun. I think people just say, actually, I don't mind you telling me what you think, but please give me the facts first. So there we have it. It's a picture in which I think you can tell from the way I'm talking. I've worked as a journalist for 40 years. I believe in journalists. I believe it's dangerous and frightening when journalists are in danger, and the trade that we do is in danger because of the economic basis. I think that's bad for society. It's bad for journalism. But I do think there is a problem of trust in journalism. And I suppose what I've been trying to do today is to say there's quite a lot of rethinking that has to go on, I think, in trying to work out how to earn that trust better. And let's be humble enough to say that on social media at its best, there are quite a lot of people who I think are doing this quite well. And if we can be modest enough to learn from them, I think we can make great progress. Thank you for listening to me today. And I hope this leads to a good discussion.
Thank you. That was very stimulating. Now it's my duty to say, acknowledge gratefully thanks and support extended by, first of all, by Indian National Center for their continued support and collaboration. We also acknowledge Raja Foundation, which in the past have been very generous with the support. And of course, we are extremely grateful to all the 3 members of the jury for taking their time out for this rather time-consuming process. We are very grateful to them. And we are also grateful to Mr. Shahbaz, our production person. And above all, we are grateful for the continuous guidance and support of our own members, Minal Pandiji, Shubha Singh, Manika Chopra, and many others who have contributed their time. Thank you very much and good evening.